Hiya, my name is Marius and I'm an amateur historic tailor. Today I'm going to go through some questions that some very lovely people sent in on Instagram as a bit of a Q&A, and I'll also do some sewing. Firstly, I'll need a project to work on while I answer questions. Username NoodleStitch sent in this. Will you share your apron pattern / recipe, the one that buttons to the waistcoat? The recipe in question is an approximately 18th century working man's apron. Hold on, let me show you. A working man's apron works a bit like this. You'll button on to the top button of your waistcoat or your jacket. Then the ties go around behind you, come back around, and tie in the front. As you can see, unlike a modern cooking apron, you don't have any kind of ties over your shoulder, and this piece is shaped more like a zone front on a women's gown than like a modern apron or a pinner apron. I have this piece here, the zone front looking piece, to protect my waistcoat, my shirt, and my jacket from whatever I'm working with. And then I have a skirt here as well, which will keep my trousers tidy. I thought it might be fun to cut and sew a new one while I answer questions, so I'll be doing that now, starting with the pattern. The important measurements that you'll need are from your waistline to the top button of your waistcoat, from your waistline as far down as you want the skirt of the apron to go, and the width that you'd like your apron to be. It's not set in stone and I won't give you my measurements, however, I think it should be pretty easy to figure out. Next, you'll want to cut your single body piece out of your fashion fabric. My first apron was made out of a green and cream striped fabric, which I picked up while I was doing an internship at the Keeler Tavern Museum in Ridgefield, Connecticut. It's a lovely little museum and it deserves so much love. Anyway, I'm not sure what the fabric content of this is, but I do love it. My next apron, the one that I'm going to make today, is going to be made out of a cotton canvas, and I'll link that in the description if you'd like to buy it from the same place as me. Now that I've got my pattern piece cut, I'm going to start hemming, and I'm also going to answer some more questions. Alright, a small change of location. I'm sitting on the bed now because I prefer to sit cross-legged when I hand sew. It's a lot more comfortable and ergonomic, and I like having what I'm working on in my lap. I'm going to start by hemming the full body piece with waxed linen thread using a whip stitch. Where am I going to start hemming? I'm going to start hemming here. This is an arbitrary choice. Alright, I've got that all set up. So I think it's time to pick out a question. I'm putting a couple pins into the hem so that everything stays in place whilst I'm hemming. My first question is from username tinyangrycrafts. It says, how long have you been making historic costumes? I've been trying to make historic costumes for about 2 years, but properly I'd say 1 year. My next question is from username creativesursty. I hope I pronounced that right. The question says, how are you dealing with self-isolation? I'm dealing. I haven't enjoyed being stuck at home as much. I'm very sad about all the sports stuff that I'm missing. One of the worst parts has been seeing teammates leave town and head home, because I'm going to miss all of them so much. Worst of all is the 4th years who are leaving, because I won't be seeing much of them next year. Our captain left Tuesday of this week, and that just doesn't feel good, you know? It doesn't feel good. However, I have had some more time to sew, and I've had some time to explore. I got to visit the ruins before Historic Scotland closed historic sites in town, which was really nice. I got to climb the tower. So I guess it's a mixed bag, really, but I'm not insane, and I haven't resorted to cannibalism yet, so. I will include some footage of me sewing, just to prove to you all that I didn't just sit there and talk to my camera. However, I am going to censor the audio because I have a terrible habit of singing to myself while I sew. I may have a caffeine problem. Alright, I think it's time for another question. This one is from, and then there's Jess. It says, life story, how did you get into sewing? Favorite time period, favorite books, tips and tricks. I'll go through those one by one. So first off is life story. Man, I was born in New York. I grew up in New York. My mom is German and my dad is English, so I'm first generation American. I grew up speaking German, although I've probably lost a large part of it just because I didn't have enough opportunity to speak when I was in middle and high school. I went to a pretty good middle and high school. They were a state school, public school, potato. And I studied Latin for 7 years in middle and high school, which was honestly the highlight of my school experience. I still have my National Latin exam medals. I really miss Latin, actually. Anyway, I was involved with a lot of artsy stuff then. Again, a lot of painting, a bit of ceramics. I didn't do much in the way of sports ball when I was in high school, although I did obviously climb. Then I wound up moving to Scotland for uni. This year, I am a fresher. Got a bit more into sports ball. And my major is classics. I'm also studying Greek and German this year because I got to pick 2 extra modules, which I've really been enjoying. I'm kind of disappointed that things have gone a bit haywire with classes because my current module is on Roman history, which I really love. And I was really excited to get into the Aeneid. I don't know, I don't think I have much of a life story. Anyway, how did you get into sewing? I got into sewing when I was really little. My mom taught me to sew, and I used to try to sew my own clothes out of old bed sheets and stuff. I was maybe 10 at the time, so I'm sure you can imagine how that turned out. And then I kind of put a pin in sewing for a while. Put a pin. Sorry. I put a pin in it for a while. I kind of shelved sewing, and I came back to it maybe 2 years ago. Favorite time period? I have to say I love the 18th century. I'm not sure what drew me to the period to begin with, but maybe the Dick Turpin song had a greater effect on my psyche in middle school than I realized. But I do love the 18th century, especially the latter half. I tend to focus in around the 1770s. I also really love Regency fashion, you know, circa 1810, and I love 1830s fashion. I have a real soft spot for that. I grew up with that Hilary Knight Cinderella book, and those illustrations, which I realize now are very 1830s, were just so beautiful. I think that might have been what got me interested in historical fashion to begin with. Favorite books? I love In the Heart of the Sea, and I love Last Hours on Everest. I also love Moby Dick. I love The Picture of Dorian Gray. As far as classical texts go, I love Metamorphoses and the Aeneid so much. Tips and tricks. Some sewing life hacks. Look for damaged buttons. Some companies will sell buttons that came out of the manufacturing process a little wrong, with little dents or nicks in them. And proper pewter buttons for costumes can cost more than I have the budget for. They can add up. So I will always go for those discounted, slightly imperfect buttons. If I can find some online, I'll link them in the description. The buttons on my waistcoat are all slightly dented, and honestly, they are so slightly flawed that it's barely noticeable. It's an excellent bargain. I will frequently use my mock-ups as lining, which is a pretty good hack to avoid wasting fabric and also to avoid wasting time. Actually, I think one of my best tips would be to live in your clothes. Wear them out, mend them, wash them. These trousers have paint on them that didn't quite come out, but stuff like that. I think the difference between a fancy dress costume and some proper, historically accurate clothing is that lived-in feeling, those little mends and stains and wear and tear that makes them feel like your clothes and not a costume. Next question is from Walter Valeda. What was your first historical costume, and how you started on historical costuming / hand sewing? My first historical costume was pretty much this. I made this brown waistcoat. I bought this cravat from Burnley and Trowbridge. I also made these trousers, and I made a shirt very similar to this one as a Regency sailor impression when I was starting out. I think that was the first proper costume that I put together, and I still love it. I got started on historical costuming and hand sewing about kind of 2 years ago. I don't know, I just saw a lot of historical fashion on my Instagram feed, and I was curious about it, so I eventually tried to get started. I made an effort to get into historical costuming about 2 years ago. I just saw a lot of it on my feed and I thought I might as well experiment with it. So I kind of got off to a false start. I tried to make a shirt out of a bed sheet. I didn't quite research as much as I should, I guess. So my first year of kind of trying to sew on and off was very iffy. And then about a year ago, I decided to get reorganized. I decided I wanted to do this properly. We just read In the Heart of the Sea in my high school English class, and it just kind of captured my imagination, I guess. I wasn't so interested in the survival part. I'm not saying I'm down with cannibalism, but at the beginning of the book, there's a lot of really good description about life in Nantucket and life aboard a whale ship, and that really caught my imagination somehow. I've always had an interest in 19th century whaling, not in modern whaling at all. I would put those two things in very different categories, but I've always had an interest in 19th century whaling because my dad's always loved Moby Dick. He has a tattoo of the whale on his arm, so I kind of got that from him. I also love Moby Dick very much. And I also grew up very close to Mystic Seaport, so I got to explore the Charles Morgan and the town quite a bit, almost every year for a while when I was younger. So I've just always had that interest, and reading In the Heart of the Sea kind of rekindled that. So I went out, I bought proper materials, pretty much all from Burnley and Trowbridge, and I sewed this impression, the shirt, well, the original shirt, this is a new one, the waistcoat, I bought the cravat and the trousers, and that was my first proper impression, and I kind of kept going from there. Actually, I would love to put together a proper Nantucketer interpretation though. If I had a chance to put together a proper interpretation, or if I had anything to use that for, I would be over the moon. I would love to reenact on a historic ship for that sort of thing. Oh, and hand sewing specifically, because I sewed for about a year before I learned to use a machine. And I only learned because I was offered an internship at the Keeler Tavern Museum, and they asked me if I knew how to use a sewing machine, and I said, yes, I can use a sewing machine. That's fine, because I wanted to work there, and I knew I could teach myself, so I had about 2 weeks to get comfortable using a sewing machine, but I did it. I used the sewing machine for all hidden seams, so construction seams would be machine sewn, and then everything would be finished by hand. But yeah, I kind of pulled an Eddie Redmayne on that one. So I do use a sewing machine now sometimes, for longer seams, construction seams, anything hidden. But I do feel more personally connected to an article of clothing if it's done by hand, you know? I have one side of the zone front bit done. It's definitely not called the zone front bit, I'm making that term up, but I'm gonna use it for the rest of the video because I can. Alright, my next question is from Aretes. It is favorite time period and fabrics to work with. I've addressed favorite time period a little bit. I really love 18th century stuff, and the majority of the things I sew are 18th century. Other than that, I've started getting involved in some medieval stuff on campus, or had started before things went a little sketchy. I'd love to do some more 17th century stuff. And I don't know, I'm a little bit interested in vintage clothing. And favorite fabrics to work with. I get very stressed about fabric that frays. I hate working with fabric that frays on me. It just makes me a little bit anxious until I get all the seams covered. So wool broadcloth. Love that stuff. That's the good stuff. Other than that though, I really like the look of printed cottons. I think they're very fun to work with, and I wish I had more reason to make stuff out of printed cottons, especially in menswear. I would love to make a banyan. I think that would be immensely fun, and it would be a majestically dramatic look. The next question is from a friend of mine. Her username is middle name Kendall. She says, when do you make time during your day to sew? I struggle with that. I also struggle with that. I haven't done a very good job of it this year. I don't know, I've just had a lot of stuff going on, and I haven't been sewing as much as I wish I could. I think hand sewing helps with that though, because if you only have tiny little pockets of time, it's a lot easier to put in a couple hand stitches instead of sitting down at the machine and getting into that whole process. So hand sewing I think is good if you only have small pockets of time. Other than that, I'll just have 1 or 2 very productive days where I don't have sports, where I have a rest day, where I'll just bang stuff out. But yeah, no, that's something I have to work on as well. My next 2 questions are from Deborah Oliveira 42. The first is, online resources for AJ sewing. Any recommendations? Yes. The #1 most helpful site to me in this entire journey has been marquise.de. It's an incredible site with an immense amount of resources and step-by-step instructions on how to construct various items, and a lot of resources about how to pick historically accurate fabrics and how to go about creating your period wardrobe. I've mainly used the resources on creating 18th century clothing, which includes some very in-depth tutorials with strong documentation. But I know there are some resources for other eras as well. There's a database, I think it's called something like Larsdottir, where you can search up artistic depictions and extant garments for things like men's waistcoats, frock coats, women's jackets, pretty much anything you can think of, which I love because it makes documenting items and finding historical examples to base your work directly off extremely easy. Aria Mozzie S says, how do you find the patterns and materials that you use? I draft my own patterns, but they are heavily based off things like The Cut of Men's Clothes by Nora Wall. The materials I use, I've struggled with materials lately because I haven't found a company similar to Burnley and Trowbridge in the UK. So right now I don't really have anywhere to order historically accurate materials from. If you have any recommendations for that, if anyone has recommendations, I would love to see them, because I'm really struggling with materials. But normally I'd buy materials from Burnley and Trowbridge, canvas and stuff like that from John & Sons Townsend and W.M. Booth Draper. I also use Renaissance fabric, which has some nice printed cottons and especially inexpensive cotton linen. Unfortunately, the combination of international shipping and customs does make it hard to source fabrics from those companies. I wind up paying almost as much in shipping and customs fees as I end up spending on fabric, which isn't really fun, but you know, c'est la vie. This next one isn't really a question, it's just a really nice comment, but I put it in with the questions because it was submitted with the questions and I really wanted to respond to it. It's from username Danielle Hurl, who says, "You're gorgeous, just so you know, and your sewing is amazing." Thank you very, very much. That's very kind and it means a lot. From Jonesy Ollie, what made you choose to study in the UK? My dad is English, so it was always an option that was on the table. I had a chance to visit some unis while I was visiting family a year or two ago, and I wound up visiting my current uni and just fell in love with it. I knew I wanted to be here, and it was my first choice after that visit. Incidentally, I never got to apply to my second choice, and I got rejected from my third choice. So, as far as the British experience compared to the American university experience, especially compared to what I've heard from my friends who do study in the US, I'm very glad I'm here. I think I like British student-athlete culture a bit more. I like that I've been able to focus in on my major, which that was actually part of my decision to come study over here instead of in the US, so I wouldn't have to take math or science. I study in Scotland, so we do have a little more variety. We don't specialize quite as hard, So I did get to pick 2 extra modules this year. I'm also studying German and Greek in addition to the classics, but it's definitely more narrowed down than in the US. And finally, the last question that I've written out is from the Freedom Banner. It says, "Don't feel as if you have to answer this. As a trans reenactor, I typically use a binder. But while I'm learning to sew, should I make a stay for binding? Is that even safe?" Ooh, that's a really good question. I'm actually going to put down my sewing to think about this one because I have a lot of thoughts. I need my tea. Firstly, as a disclaimer, I'm not qualified to give any kind of medical advice, and I'm probably only qualified to talk about the issue of binding as it relates to my body type. I have been trying to figure out what to do about that issue myself for a while. I personally don't wear a binder very much. I've had some issues with that. I don't know what it is. I just don't respond to it particularly well. I know you're supposed to be allowed to wear them up to 8 hours. I wore a binder in the correct size for 7 hours and got benched for 2 weeks because I bruised some ribs. So I don't bind particularly much. I'm not binding right now. And I don't think the effect is too bad. I personally just tend to wear a sports bra underneath whatever clothes I'm wearing to reenact. Stays could be an interesting idea. I don't necessarily think there'll be a health issue with stays, because a lot of female reenactors wear stays, and fortunately the concept is, you know, to rather flatten the front. So it could work. My only concerns would be what you layer the stays with, because if you're wearing female clothes, you've obviously got a shift underneath your stays, between your skin and the stays. And I suppose if you were wearing a pair of stays with men's clothes, you would either have to wear your stays between your waistcoat and your shirt in order to protect your skin, which I don't imagine would be particularly easy to hide. Or you'd be wearing it over just bare skin, which would probably soil the stays and not be particularly comfortable. But I don't know, if you decide to make stays and have a good solution for that, I would love to hear about it, and I'd love to hear your perspective on it. I will say I have a much easier time feeling confident in historical clothing, just because there are so many layers, and for example, with what I'm wearing right now, you know, the combination of the cravat and the apron and my waistcoat and my shirt, there's so much bulk covering here that I really don't need to bind. I would love to hear what other trans reenactors do though, and I'd love to get other perspectives on this. So if you're trans and you reenact and you wear a binder underneath your clothes, or you wear stays underneath your clothes, or you just wear a sports bra underneath your clothes, I'd love to hear your advice and your life hacks. So that's that for the questions. Thank you so much for sending them in. I will go finish hemming the apron off camera, and then I will add some strings. I finished hemming the apron, and now I just need to add some finishing touches. Firstly, I'll create a buttonhole near the very top of the apron so that I can button it to my waistcoat. Then I'll create a thread bar, a little loop at the top of the apron so that I can hang it from a peg. I do that by bringing the thread back and forth to create a little loop made up of a couple of threads, I guess, and then buttonhole stitching over the entire thing. Finally, I'll attach the apron strings. I'm using a little under a yard for each string out of a cotton tape because that's what I had in my stash. I'd advise using a slightly thinner tape. I think the tapes on this apron are about 1/4 of an inch. This is unfortunately all I had, so it's what I'm going to use. I'm not sure quite how the tape should be affixed because I haven't had a chance to examine an extant one of these. However, I'm not sure how wrong I can go with these, and I'm going to interpret a little and just backstitch these down. So what I've done is I've attached the tape so that the tape is kind of running into the apron instead of out, kind of backward. And then I'm going to flip it over and do a second line of back stitching so that all of the raw edges of the tape are enclosed. Anyway, I finish my tapes by rolling them over and doing a tiny rolled hem at the end. I realize that's a very finicky detail to put in, but as I said earlier, stuff fraying makes me extremely anxious, and if I don't have to deal with that, then I would rather not. Alright, there she is. Let's try her on and see if she fits. And there we go, a sturdy working man's apron. I hope this tutorial was helpful, and I hope that you try this at home. I think this apron would make an excellent addition to anyone's kit as a nice way to keep your clothes tidy and neat, and it would make an excellent project for a beginner if you'd like to practice hemming and other basic skills like buttonholes and backstitch. Thank you as well to all the lovely people who sent in questions. I really enjoyed answering everything. I think that's all for now. Please do like and subscribe if you'd like to. Stay safe, and I'll see you next time.